I'd like to welcome everybody to the Town Council Workshop on July 18th, 2023. I will begin with roll call. Councillor Height.
Here.
Councillor Meany.
Present.
Councillor McGuire.
Present.
And I'm Councillor Chappell. I'm also here. And to my right is Town Manager Nate Rudy. We're going to begin with a discussion of updates to the self-storage ordinance. Doug, would you mind just coming up and giving us an overview of the content that's changed since we spoke about this last?
Thank you. Doug Webster, Planning Director. As the council and some of our esteemed residents are aware, they've been through multiple different versions of this the proposed self-storage standards. Some of the most significant changes with this version include a planning board authority to reduce the perimeter buffer. It's in section F on page 6. There's a specific provision for properties that abut the main turnpike authority, and on council packet page 8, sub D and sub E, what we did is we divided up sort of requirements, and then there's a separate section E that provides some guidance and gives the planning board a little more authority. We have also added adaptive reuse in response to comments. On D6 on page 4, including the planning board authority to adjust for qualifying existing buildings. It's in F1 on page 6. If the perimeter buffer does not meet the requirements, we made sure there's a provision to allow up to 5 years for that to meet the standards. There's a new revised section H on council packet page 10. Lot frontage development standards. It's intended to memorialize my understanding of the council's intent to try not to have additional road frontage utilized for self-storage. You can go back, if you will, but not sideways. We attempted anyway to clarify the applicability of the 3-acre maximum size of any one area. Tried to be clear that if you want more than one of those areas, you can have that. So we restructured that a little bit, and we eliminated the minimum lot size, as it was pointed out, that the minimum lot size for the performance standards for this use exceeds, the version then exceeded the minimum lot size in the commercial zoning district. So we just eliminated that. If someone wants to build a smaller self-storage facility, then they should absolutely be able to do that. So those are some of the highlights. I would like to think we're getting closer, but I guess that's why we're here to find out. So.
And I believe there was also an amendment to the design standards to put parking in the rear. Is that correct?
That was. We added that to this. It's not really related to self-storage.
Okay.
But given that the village design standards, I don't think that the proposal is not to have self-storage in village center, but the reason that we included it is because it seemed like an opportune time to get that amendment added to the village design standards in response to prior council comments.
Okay. So we didn't add that amendment to the self-storage design standards also?
Again, Kristen and I included it just to try to get that done. It just seemed like an opportunity. Happy to be wrong, my read of the council was that there's support for that, and before we get additional residential or commercial developments in the village or village center proper, it seemed prudent to get that on the books to try to memorialize that. So
okay.
it's not really related to self-storage.
No, right. it seems like we would need a separate, I don't know if do we need a first reading for those design standards for the village? I can't remember if we did a reading, a second reading with those, or if it was just, something we voted on without,
Oh,
yeah.
you're right on it. And
Okay.
so the proposal would be, if there is consensus for self-storage, what would come back, it'd be two first reads. One first read for changes to zoning for self-storage, and first read for amendment to village design standards
Okay,
for
so
the parking.
we would need a first read for the design standards.
You would,
Okay.
yep. But given that this was a workshop, it seemed like an opportune time for to solicit some input from
Sure.
the council.
Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts on the changes that Doug just went over?
I've got some comments, but
Okay.
Matthew, you want to
Yeah,
go ahead?
go ahead, Matt.
Okay, well, I'll have to apologize in advance for sort of coming late to the game. I wasn't at the last meeting where we got input from the public. And I agree and understand that we wouldn't want to be using up commercial road frontage for self-storage facilities. I get that. I guess I just have some questions before where would this apply? Where are self-storage facilities, where could you put one in Gray? And where would this, can you put one anywhere, or you can just put one in the commercial district, or how does that work?
The discussions today, I can't speak, obviously the council has the final call here, but the discussions to date with the council have been, at least until we get the new zoning on the books, to allow self-storage in what's called the light manufacturing overlay district, which if you look at a zoning map of the town of Gray, there are basically 3 commercial districts. You've got what I call 100 North, you've got 100 South, and there's a little commercial district just south of Gray Flats. And so to answer your question, this would be the 2 commercial districts, the 100 North and 100 South, but not the one near the plaza.
Yeah, and the long-term goal was that we would eventually look at opening up other areas of town once our zoning was finalized and aligned with the comprehensive plan. And our intent in writing this was looking towards the future and knowing that it would be applicable in other zones.
And so the impression I get, the concerns are self-storage developments in areas with conflicting uses like residential property. Is that the basis of the genesis of this idea of you have to put the development 300 feet from the road and have these mature vegetation buffers around it?
I think partially the intentions of the perimeter buffer were to buffer adjacent properties, that borrowing, if you will, on the principle that each development should stand on its own 2 feet. The 300-foot, there's been, if you followed it, there's been quite a bit of, understandably, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the 300 feet. The original impetus and the driving force, if you will, for the 300-foot setback for new self-storage facilities was to try to preserve the front portion of commercially zoned properties. One of the town's long-term objectives memorialized in the comprehensive plan, and I believe there's council support for it, is to try to diversify the tax base. And so the intention when it was originally crafted was to try to preserve that front portion for other commercial uses, allowing self-storage behind it, if you will. I don't want to, I always feel uncomfortable speaking for the council.
That's a good summary of our
Okay.
thoughts so far.
Yeah, well, and that comes through. When I read through the other, through the standards, it seems like there are standards that apply in non-residential, intensively developed non-residential areas, or I can't remember the phrase that and that there were buffer requirements there. And I wondered if I misread that, and, you know, like, I'm just wondering if you have a paved area in a non-residential area, you know, intensively developed zone, and you wanna put a self-storage unit, you know, like a small self-storage unit as part of other enterprises you're doing or whatever, does that then get you into this requirement for these buffers?
The intention is to have the buffers applicable for any self-storage facility. The language that I think you're recalling is in regards, we actually borrowed it from the Good Neighbor standards in Article 10, I think it's 402.1014, I think it is. And the intention is if an area is already if in the planning board's opinion the area is already densely developed with non-residential uses, to give the planning board some additional latitude to reduce the required depth and to reduce some of the buffer requirements to try to make more efficient use of the site for the self-storage use.
But would those reduced buffers involve, you know, the goal of having a mature vegetation, you know, whatever the minimum standard is surrounding that self-storage that's otherwise surrounded by pavement?
It's in section F, and what it does is section F starts on the bottom of council packet page 6.
Mm-hmm.
And what it does is it basically establishes the goal, and then once you get down to F10, it gives the planning board some additional latitude. One of the observations that I have over the years is, particularly depending on the planning board, if you don't provide some basic standards and or some basic design considerations to be used by town staff and by planning board, then a lot of times there's a propensity, perhaps understandably, to cut the buffer down so there's no buffer at all. And so Councilor McGuire would remember we did the same thing with the residential open space subdivision, where you say, okay, planning board, you have authority to reduce the buffer, but in your discussions to reduce the buffer, you might want to consider the following. So the objective is not to mandate, but to try to help provide guidance for future staff and future planning boards, because planning boards and staff change over time, and that's really it's a little bit of a softer approach, but it is intended to memorialize the intentions behind, in this instance, reducing the buffer.
Right. And so I'm looking at, you know, subparagraph D, I guess, on council packet page 8.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in consideration of whether approved perimeter buffer reduction or alteration, the planning board should consider treatment of the area adhere to the following standards. In no case shall any portion of the perimeter buffer be less than 25 feet in width. And so in the scenario, you know, and again, I just want to make sure that I'm getting this right, but in the scenario I envision, right, there is an existing development, you know, with lots of pavement or gravel or whatever, no, you know, natural features, in an area with, you know, similar development nearby. And the owner of this property wants to put in, you know, like a single self-storage, you know, like a single self-storage building to sort of diversify his portfolio or whatever. Does that then require him to install a 25-foot vegetated buffer in an area that's not otherwise vegetated?
I think the intention is to have some type of buffer. And to get on the shirt tails of that, D is intended to provide some more rigid standards, so that there needs to be 25 feet minimum, and the D, was it I, and then the DII is put in place to ensure that if there are buildings placed, let's say you've got one, I love the whiteboard here. road out here, you've got a parcel like this, and this is going to be, you're gonna have some commercial use here.
Mhm.
You're gonna have the self-storage back here.
Right.
The second sub-II, I guess you call it,
Mhm.
under D, that's intended to ensure that if there's a building here and a building here, but this is all one lot now, that in the future, this could be separated from that. Does that make sense?
I see what you're saying, but I guess I'm not, I am wondering, so you're talking about DII?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, so that you're saying in that case, you need to allow a setback so that all the buildings can meet the required setbacks if you decide to subdivide
A lot of, I mean, you could.
or divide the lot or whatever.
You could condominiumize it, but if
Mhm.
these are to be separate parcels, and you're putting, and you have an existing or a new structure here and another structure here, it makes sense, I think, for possible, in the event that you want to divide these, let's say the front was retail and the back was self-storage.
Mhm.
It makes sense to me anyway, to site the buildings in a manner that allows for the lot to be divided in the future. And so that's why I tried to, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I understood that, and even if it's not the intent to divide at the time of the development, you're still required to have those setbacks.
That's the proposal. Inevitably, what happens in a situation if they put them too close is they propose to divide the property in the future, it ends up at the Board of Appeals for a setback reduction. And if the buildings are new, then maybe we should put them in a manner that allows them to be divided in the future.
Right.
That was the thought.
Right, but so that, your scenario there, and I'm sorry I'm taking up so much time, but your scenario there is for a new development.
Or it could be let's say this building was existing, the front building was
Mhm.
existing under the adaptive for use provision that's a little bit earlier, and this was being added. I'm trying to plant the seed that they could be separated in the future.
Okay. And so if that were any other kind of building they were putting in there other than self-storage, would they have to install a 25-foot buffer with mature vegetation?
There are buffering requirements housed in Article 10, site plan. They would
Mhm.
need some type of a buffer. It probably, the buffering standards in Article 10, site plan, are not quite as specific as they are in the performance standards that are proposed here.
Mhm. So I'm all for having this, having an effective visual buffer between, this use of the self-storage units or outside storage and other, residential uses.
Mhm.
But if it's all commercial, going down the line, and the act of putting a self-storage unit would require you to put in a 25 or however wide mature vegetated buffer where you otherwise wouldn't have to. I question that. I question the need for buffering, non-residential uses from non-residential uses in the same way that you would buffer self-storage from a residential use.
So is your issue not with the length of the buffer, but rather the fact that we're asking for a vegetative screen? Is that?
So here's the thing. If they're going to locate one of these, in an area that doesn't impact residences and it's already a commercial development, I don't want to have this sort of need to buffer it as if it were a residential, as if you were. I would like to encourage these sort of things to go to, already developed areas. I just when I read the standard first, I thought, okay, here's the model. We put in a 300-foot driveway into the woods, otherwise undisturbed area, and then we have to maintain some of that for buffer or plant some buffers. If And to me, it's more preferable, sorry, to direct this sort of development to areas that are already developed, I guess and to actually sort of say, well, if you don't locate in a residential neighborhood, or if you're not located, if you're not going out into the woods, there's some benefit to that, to locating in an area that's already commercially developed. That's all I've got.
Yeah,
And
go ahead, Doug, yeah.
If I may, thank you. And I don't think that conceptually, at least based on prior discussions with the council, I don't think we're that far from that.
Mhm.
These as the chair, I think, alluded to, these standards were an attempt to allow self-storage, because right now the moratorium's still in effect. Excuse me. The goal was to get the moratorium not in effect anymore and to revisit in entirety. I mean, I conceptually, if you want a self-storage facility and it's buffered it's really a pretty benign use. And the intention was to have that broader discussion about where they should be allowed as an integral part of the new zoning. So this is sort of part one of two, I guess.
Mhm. Yeah, and I guess I would say that in any event where you've got, forest or undeveloped land, and you turn it into filled, paved, roofed area, there's nothing benign about that.
Hence the buffer. Understood?
No, I'm talking, no.
Oh.
I mean, the impact itself, of filling and paving is not benign.
It has an environmental impact.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's, an environmental impact that's of great concern right now in our climate crisis, I guess, is what I would say.
Let's just hear what, I know, Dan, you had some thoughts too, so I would like to hear what your thoughts are, and maybe we can circle back to this
Sure.
particular discussion.
On packet page 3, B2, Doug, on the third line, you use the phrase practically achievable. Can you, one of the feedback we get from the planning board pretty consistently is they want more standards to implement and fewer decisions to have to, fewer value judgments to make about some of the questions around buffering. And I guess, how would you define practically achievable for them? Because it sounds like there's room for movement there, because if someone decides it's impractical or it's not practical, then where do you go from there?
The concept, if you look, I would respectfully submit that the intention was to dovetail with the first sentence. The first sentence says you can rebuild same height, size, location as the original, but as an example, let's say there was no buffer whatsoever from those buildings to a public road.
2 is on expansion.
I'm sorry, you're on expansion. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so it's B2, the third line down where that line starts practically achievable. So any self-storage facility that is proposed to be expanded after the adoption of these standards should be required to
Okay.
obtain planning board approval and shall be subject to all practically achievable self-storage performance standards.
So it's conceptually similar. So if you had, as it says, an expansion, if you had an existing facility and you were adding additional buildings, let's say going back deeper into the parcel,
Yeah,
and the way the current self-storage buildings were up by the road, there was not a buffer there, that maybe there would be some evergreen trees planted there. Nothing substantial with the existing buildings. I understand the planning board's looking for more specific guidance as a practical matter. I would submit that there's a balance to be struck between giving the writing detailed standards versus giving the planning board latitude. If the planning board's looking for more guidance, then we could add some language that talked about taking into account ABC. But at
Well,
a certain point, the planning board has to.
You're never gonna take all the judgment out of the decisions, I understand that, I'm not looking for that kind of level of detail, but it just, I'm just not sure, I guess, if I had, what that phrase, practically achievable, and we don't have to get stuck there, but that, it just feels a little more nebulous maybe than we want, maybe not, I don't know how others feel, but that's the first thought. In the next one down, number 3, repairs, replacement, rebuilding. It goes on to read, such repair, replacement, and rebuilding shall be subject to all, again, practically achievable self-storage performance standards and design standards as determined by the code enforcement officer with consultation of the town planner. What's out of bounds, I guess, then, for, like, is the 300-foot setback out of bounds? Or is that something that could be adjusted if it's not practically achievable?
For an expansion or repairs?
I was on 3, repairs now. I see that phrase again happens, that practically achievable
Huh.
phrase again happens.
Well, it does state in the sentence above it that it needs to have the same size, height, and location of the original structure. So if the original structure was not 300 feet back, then it wouldn't. If it was, then it would need to retain that setback.
Okay.
I'm all ears for more. I don't know. I've been writing ordinances a long time. It's hard to come up with some language that gives planning board flexibility, but doesn't give an existing non-conforming self-storage facility carte blanche to expand.
Yep,
So
I understand.
I don't know where that balance is.
Okay, well, I'm just seeking clarification. I'm not finding fault, don't misunderstand me. I'm just trying to make sure I understand what exactly we're implementing. On the next packet page 4, which is C3, any outdoor storage facility shall be located at least 100 feet from any property line and shall be subject to additional standards as detailed in this section. So the building itself would have to be 100 feet from the property line. I'm not sure. I guess what would have to be 100 feet from the property line?
As I attempted to say, the outdoor storage, we had a discussion, couple workshops, first readings back, where I asked the question of the council if you wanted to allow out storage in an outside area versus undercover.
Okay.
And the feedback from the council was we're okay in an outside area as long as it's far enough from the property line.
And that wouldn't apply in the case of the turnpike though, because that would,
It was intended to, I'm trying to follow
Yeah, no, I
the
understand.
guidance I
I'm
was
just-
given. If we wanted an exemption from that for the turnpike, I suppose it should be added on point.
I don't know if we do, but it's just something to,
Well, we reduce the buffer requirements for properties that are parallel
abutting the
abutting the turnpike. So it would make sense that all elements of the structures and supplementary things like outdoor storage should follow those same guidelines.
Okay. So that's on council packet page 8D, F10C. Okay, we can add that.
okay.
Okay.
So no, or reduced reduced buffer for outdoor storage when it directly abuts MTA.
On packet page 6, pardon me, package page 7. Number 6. That first line, the full depth of the perimeter buffer shall consist of dense, mature, natural vegetation. The planning board has been using the language, mixed, mature, deciduous, and evergreen vegetation of late. It feels like that might be something to consider for just clarifying what the buffer would be made out of.
We talked about evergreens being encouraged, predominantly evergreens or
Yeah,
something.
there is a predominantly evergreens there, but it's only in one spot of the ordinance.
You're advocating number 6 to include that. Okay.
Yeah,
Sure.
I would suggest that. I think that language would clarify everything for everybody, because there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of sort of nebulous conversation around what the buffer has to be. When I sit and I listen to the planning board meetings with people.
Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Yeah, go ahead.
We're talking about number 6, and so what you're proposing, Dan, is that we would specify that the buffer be predominantly evergreen.
It'd be a dense mix of mature, deciduous, and evergreen, so it would be a mix. It wouldn't
Yeah,
have to be.
we mentioned, as Doug just noted, he mentions evergreens in other parts of this ordinance as the
Mhm.
type of vegetation we'd like to see. I think Dan would just like that clarified in this
Yep.
one section. Is what
Well, I think, I remember somewhere else, and I
Yeah,
can't put my hand
I
on
do
it,
too.
that
Agree.
it said
Yeah.
predominantly evergreen.
Oh, it's right, it's actually in number 7 underneath.
And,
Yeah.
and if the idea is to provide a visual buffer to neighbors, I think evergreen, it should be predominantly evergreen, because
Mhm.
otherwise it's gonna be very little visual buffer for 7 months out of the year.
Correct,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
That's where I was coming from.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I would like it to specify predominantly, if that's our goal.
Mhm. Go
Just
ahead, Nate.
as a clarifying point, do you want the language replaced, or do you want that put in as like an EG in parenthesis?
It can be put in that way, either way, I guess.
Okay, so dealer's choice for Dan,
Yeah,
for Doug.
I mean, we have it in parentheses in number 7, directly under number 6. so
yeah,
that-
I think it's not a hill I'm gonna die on, the predominantly evergreen, I think, I understand that, but the goal, I think, is to do a mix of whatever's there, but still have some, obviously, if none of it's evergreen, then you're not gonna have much of a screen during the winter time.
Right.
Just having a mix. The only other question I guess I have is on packet page 8. And, actually, no, it's on packet page 9, sorry. It's the perimeter buffer where we talk about fencing or screening. Can you sort of just walk through when you would envision that kind of screening versus vegetative buffer?
You're at the tail end of sub D, right?
Yes. Sub D and E.
I tried to lead in there for structures in self-storage facilities do not exceed 20 feet in height,
Yeah,
and buildings converted. I tried to lay out the examples of scenarios when the planning board could apply
combined,
yes.
sort of like Cumberland Farms sort of a deal.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yep, and again, I pirated some of this from the Good Neighbor Standards in Article 10.
Yep.
It was reused as an example, I believe, with Aroma Joe's
Yeah.
as well.
On packet page 10, number 4 at the top of the page, where it talks about testing for outdoor storage. Do we need to put what we want them to test for? Do we need to be that specific? Because I think that's gonna be the question. Someone's gonna say, what do you want me to test for? I think we're gonna have to have an answer.
Okay.
And I think it would make sense to put it in the ordinance myself. The next one, number 5, you talk about it talks about the, do I have the right one? No, number 4 still, talks about those reports being done by January 31st of each year. And I wondered if just seasonally, if it might be better to have the deadline at a different time of year? Or is it just easier for you to do it on a calendar year?
It's easier on a calendar year, and the other thing, having worked in codes, many ordinances intentionally choose the submittal of the reporting during a relatively slow time of year, rather than like July 1,
Yeah,
so.
I'm okay with that. It just made me wonder, from the standpoint of, you're not gonna be able to do any testing in January.
Understood. This would be the annual report, and the other thing is that
Doesn't have to be done
if it
now.
says annually, then the future staff has
Okay.
to recon when this got its final approval. It's easier to have a fixed date that would be applicable, similar to that which we do for gravel pits.
Do you have a database now of businesses that you're expecting reports from?
Not that I'm aware of, other than gravel pits. Gravel pits, I know, are on a very fixed schedule
Okay.
for changes to the operations and developed area, what they call it, the area, pit area.
Marty, did you have anything you wanted to comment?
The only thing I was thinking about was the lighting in the area at night. For safety reasons, that's all.
Do we address lighting anywhere?
Yeah,
I can't
it does,
I can't
actually.
recall. Yeah.
Yep, that's,
I
there's
forget
a
what
reference to
section
dark
it is. Yeah,
sky,
it does have that reference.
packet page 6, number 10.
Yeah.
Says in addition to lighting requirements in site plan, it also needs to meet dark sky.
Yep.
Which we had a little bit of experience with the sign ordinance,
Yep.
so.
Could the lights be triggered by motion, or do they have to be on all the time?
That's difficult. From what I've seen, there are some developers, self-storage facility owners, operators, or commercial properties that like to have the lights on for security purposes. It doesn't seem fair to me to say you can't light it if you meet the dark sky.
Yeah.
It would seem like that would be what we're trying to achieve without imposing regulations on private businesses.
Mm-hmm.
Just a thought. So.
Okay.
Yeah. I would think that lights coming on and off might actually be more of an impact on neighbors than lights that were just on.
Well, that's true, that could.
Yeah.
If a cat walks by or something.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
As long as it's not a black cat.
Well, it's not my 2 black cats.
So it seems like most of these comments are either fine the way they are or can be slightly amended without much, not that I can speak for your work, but not too much
Sure. Yes,
more
sure.
work. But I did want to loop back around to Matthew's concerns about the vegetative buffers in areas that are already commercially developed and paved. Does anyone else have any concerns about what Matthew was raising?
Yeah, well, I think, yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about a lot of different things with buffers. I
Yeah.
think the piece that Doug brings up around being able to subdivide the different businesses or the different lots is something that we hadn't actually discussed before, but which does make sense.
Mhm.
You know, it's a tough one in an already developed commercial space. One of the things that I've struggled with, other than the 300-foot setbacks, is the amount of land that can get tied up in the buffers. I do struggle a little bit with that.
Yeah, it is difficult to visualize every scenario, you know, you're never gonna figure out what every lot is going to look like. So we're trying to just have some guidelines that could be applicable to most, if not all the lots that would be effective for the intent that we're looking for. I do tend to agree with Matthew that if it's already the type of lot that is commercial use and, you know, predominantly paved, that we perhaps don't need a vegetative screen between the two lots that we're trying to potentially have developed. But I would like to retain the width of that buffer,
Sure.
so that we could accomplish what you've outlined in that drawing there.
So, if I may, don't mean to
Go ahead.
interrupt. On council packet, page 8, if you look at 10B, what if we were to augment that language and say, in such situations, the planning board shall have the authority to eliminate the buffer requirements, provided that the buildings are separated to meet setbacks in the event the lot's divided, or something like that.
Right, that section is specific to commercial and industrial zones, is that?
I think that's
Is
the
that- yeah.
type of scenario that I'm hearing the council discuss.
I think that's a decent compromise personally.
I mean, I think,
Yeah.
with the design standards, I think that you can design it in such a way that you don't need the buffer in that circumstance.
Okay.
Yeah.
It could be just like D and E, it could have some yeah, all right, sure. That's what, yeah, Kristen and I worked on, Kristen and I worked on this.
Okay.
But like in the event, please tell me if I'm just lurching in the wrong time. In the event that you're on the edge of an industrial or commercial zone and you're against a, you know, non-compatible use, you're against a residential use, I wouldn't be opposed to requiring a buffer in that situation. Yeah, if you know what I mean. And I know there's so many scenarios and that you can't fix everything on, you know, in that, but I'm just talking.
Well, you
Yep.
could in that case, you could buffer
Right.
the side of the property, but
Right.
not necessarily
Right.
have to do what you might think of as the front. Yep.
Right.
Right.
And that language is in there, that do not directly abut any properties outside of
Ah.
the district. And I,
Good.
just in general, I really I've tried for years, I don't like it when you say abutting residential use. You really need to go with districts, because it puts the planning board in the awkward position of determining what is and is not a residential
Yes.
use.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah, the actual words, I totally defer to you guys on.
Okay. So, Doug, it sounds, correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like we don't have too many more edits to make if we want to begin a first read again.
We can, I don't know if there are comments from those that have provided input to date. My thought with advocating that it be a workshop item was to try to avoid repeating first read again. I don't know,
Okay. I'm just concerned about the time. I mean, I am curious to hear what folks think, but I'd like to, if you want to come up and say something, I would welcome that, but I really respectfully request that you limit it to about a minute, because we have another agenda item on our agenda. So, if you do come up, just please state your name, and your address and sign in.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Scott Liberty. I like what I'm hearing tonight. I think it's positive. I hope we keep going in that direction. We want to work with the town. We really do, and I really like what I'm hearing. We haven't read this at all. We haven't seen it, so I reserve the right to come to the public hearing with some concerns or objections.
It is in the tonight's packet if you wanted to review it at a later time.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Our biggest concern still is the 300-foot setback. We think it's too much, especially outside of the village in the commercial industrial overlay zone. I don't speak for the group. I'd like to see something around 250 feet. I know the group wants more. But I'm telling you from my point of view, 300 is just too much for us. And then the only other concern I have personally is for the climate control. Everyone knows I own the old Sear auction business. I have had Dan out there. I store my grandkids' snowmobiles there. I have pools there. But I have a marijuana, I don't, my tenant grows medical marijuana clones and does an excellent job. But under the ordinance that I had read, I wouldn't be able to have climate control storage units in there unless I evicted the tenant. I read that I wasn't allowed to have the clone medical marijuana and half the building. It's a 9,000 square foot building, so he takes up 4,500 square feet. I could take the other 4,500 square feet and put in 25, climate controlled units. So I'm concerned about that because it doesn't make sense to me. What does it matter if he's growing clones for marijuana, medical, or someone's growing tomatoes? If they're growing tomatoes, I can have climate control. But if they're growing medical marijuana, I can't have climate control.
Right. I mean, I hear what you're saying for that specific tenant. We are planning to look at our cannabis ordinance soon, because that's been a request from several residents. So it seems to me that might be a better fit for when we're reviewing that ordinance. Maybe we come back to this one and look at that specifically.
I'm trying to keep him.
Yeah.
He's a hard-working guy,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, I want to do climate control, and I'm trying to work with him. I don't want to have to kick him out just because the ordinance says he can't be there if the other half of the building is walled off and people are storing their snowmobiles. Thank you.
Well, yeah, thank you, and we'll certainly consider that as we move forward with reviewing marijuana standards. Would anyone else like to make a brief comment? Okay, well, I do thank you all for coming out. I know you've been intimately involved with this ordinance, so we appreciate your attention to it. We'll have to get some feedback from Doug later about like a timeline for first read and things, yeah, okay. Okay, I'm gonna move on just to our next agenda item, which is just kind of circle back about the town council rules, which we tabled at our first full council meeting of this session. Dan, I know you had a lot of thoughts about edits, and we're gonna take a stab at doing some. I don't know if you've had a chance to do that yet, or?
Yeah, I only have a couple actually.
Okay.
After the last conversation, I sort of withdrew some of mine. One of them, and I'm not sure how best to word this, workshops generally speaking are for the council to have discussions, as opposed to when we have our formal meetings and we allow for public discussion. Traditionally, we've not allowed for public discussion at workshops. And I'd like to figure out how to get that into workshops, because I think, like tonight,
Yeah.
I just think when people come out, it's silly to not give them the opportunity to give us their input.
I
So,
agree with that.
Yeah.
my thought is that on packet page 27, under section 02, which is council workshops, we just, it says workshop meetings are where the town business is discussed but not voted on, shall be held from time to time as determined by the council. I don't know if we have to actually even put something in our rules to allow public comment, or whether it just is, something we have to figure out how to do with our agenda.
I'm not sure it needs to be explicit in the rules. What I would like to see is, for all meetings, directions about how public comment should be run, like a time limit, how the sign-in process and things. South Portland had a really good model for how they've defined public comment.
Yep. There is our rules of debate, which is section 13, which is on packet page 29.
Yeah,
Kind of was a, the combining of the old decorum policy and those rules. I think that would be the best place to put that if it needs to be clarified.
right, I would agree. And then I think it would be up to us to just make a point of including public comment on our agendas if that's something that we value. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'd be fine with that. If we could just create some rules around how that looks, especially for workshops.
Yep, okay. The other small changes are in wording on that same packet page 30, under, when a question is under debate, 1B, it just simply would change to table. And then 1C, I would just simply change the previous, to the previous question. Under E, further down the page, if a question or situation arises that is not addressed in the town charter, I think it would be better to remove that "or" and just say charter ordinance or these rules, then the chairperson shall refer to Robert's rules. I'm not gonna make a suggestion that we add the Robert's rules sort of notes that I created. I think we can still use those, but, and those are really only the 3 changes I would want to make.
Okay. We went into depth about changes we wanted to see at our last council meeting.
Yeah.
And so you're saying you don't want to make the changes you had suggested before? Is that?
Not at this time, I guess. I mean,
Okay.
unless there's other people have support for it.
Well, we definitely needed to add it was already something we approved, but it wasn't in this, edition of the rules, where we have the notation that our meetings are now hybrid.
Yeah.
So we definitely needed to add that back in. We did talk about adding a public comment.
I think we can add the hybrid language right at the very beginning.
Yeah, that's where it was. I know we've already voted on that. I don't know
Yeah.
where that addition
Went.
went, but
See if I can find
yeah.
it.
Okay. Well, did you still want to take a crack at editing the
Yeah, I will.
document? Okay, and
Yep.
then we can bring it back. Just let us know when you're
Okay,
ready. No rush, but we can put it
Yep.
on an agenda so we don't have to, or so we could take it off the table rather.
I can have it ready for our next meeting, if you want.
August, okay.
Yeah.
When is our, August 15th?
15th, I think.
15th, I think.
6021A5 is where you had discussed adding hybrid language.
Yep. Thank you, Nate.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Did anyone have anything else they wanted to add about town council rules? Okay. I know we talked about it at length at our last meeting, so.
Yep.
All right. Well, we will adjourn our workshop and reconvene at 7 o'clock for our full council meeting. Thank you, everyone.
Mhm.